Hello, I'm Faye Jensen, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to the fourth and final of our 2021 winter lectures, and thank you so much for joining us. If you should have any issues with connection, please refer to your reminder email from Zoom, as it has the contact information for Celine Anchetta, who is offering technical support today. And if you haven't already done so, would you please enter your name and where you live in the chat box. Before we begin, I'd like our Vice President of Development, Scott Stevens, to say hello. Scott?
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to virtually meet you all today. As Faye mentioned, my name is Scott Stevens, and I'm the new Vice President for Development at the South Carolina Historical Society. Over the past few weeks, I've been able to dig in and really learn all of the wonderful things that the South Carolina Historical Society has to offer. And if you love history, particularly South Carolina history, the South Carolina Historical Society is the best organization in South Carolina to be affiliated with. And I want to encourage you to visit the South Carolina Historical Society website at schistory.org and find all the ways that you can be an advocate for South Carolina history. I look forward to meeting all of you at one time in the near future. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. As a reminder to all in attendance, we'll be using the chat box to take questions. We hope to have time for those after the talk is over, and I'll be able to read them out from there. Now I want to introduce our speaker. Huw David is a fellow of Wolfson College, University of Oxford, where he is the college's development director. His first book, Trade, Politics, and Revolution, South Carolina and Britain's Atlantic Commerce, 1730 to 1790, was published by the University of South Carolina Press in 2018. It received the George C. Rogers Jr. Prize for the best book on South Carolina history, which, as most of you know, is given by the South Carolina Historical Society. The manuscript of that book was previously awarded the Hines Prize by the College of Charleston. Dr. David's writing appears in several academic journals, including Global Networks, the Journal of Southern History, the South Carolina Historical Magazine, and Action Learning, Research and Practice. He has held visiting fellowships at institutions including the University of South Carolina and Huntington Library, Los Angeles. Dr. David is also a trustee of Soulgrave Manor, the home of George Washington's ancestors, a member of the academic advisory panel of the Benjamin Franklin House, London, and a judge of the Benjamin Franklin House Literary Prize. He is an affiliate faculty member at the College of Charleston's Carolina Lowcountry and Atlantic World program. And he is also governor of a local village primary school and a member of the school's Resource and Finance Committee. He lives in Oxford with his wife and young son, and we are delighted that he agreed to speak for us today. Please welcome Dr. Huw David.
Thank you very much, Faye. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and a real pleasure to be connected virtually, at least, to Charleston once again. And I see many of you have joined not only from across the United States, but indeed internationally as well. So thank you very much for being here. I spent many happy hours in the South Carolina Historical Society's fireproof building, and for that matter, the South Caroliniana Library at the University of South Carolina and the State Archives in Columbia, conducting the research that made up first my doctoral thesis, then my book. But I'm speaking today from Oxford, England, and it's here in Britain that I want to begin today's talk, and where much of the action takes place. Now, perhaps that might seem strange for a meeting of the South Carolina Historical Society, but it speaks to Britain's formative role in the state's development, and in particular the role of the London-based merchants who were instrumental in this. So we'll begin on the banks of the River Thames in 1774 in Richmond, now a suburb of London, but then a village 10 miles or so southwest of the metropolis, and a meeting of two men. I'll share my screen. One of the two men at that meeting was Henry Lawrence, a name that will be familiar to many of you, one of Charleston's most important merchants, planters, and politicians, later to be president of the Continental Congress. The publication of his papers in 16 volumes by the University of South Carolina Press make him the best documented and probably best known figure in the history of colonial South Carolina. Here he is, shown in John Singleton Copley's famous painting from 1782. The other man at that meeting in Richmond, south of London, was Lawrence's former mentor, James Crockett, by then more than 70 years old, but for much of the previous 4 decades, a man of great significance for early South Carolina. He is now, though, largely forgotten. Lawrence had been apprenticed to the older man in Crockett's London counting house in the late 1740s. The pair had fallen out when Lawrence was apparently overlooked in being made a partner in Crockett's firm. Lawrence returned to Charleston to forge his own path, building on some of the connections he had made in London, Bristol, and Liverpool, ultimately with great success. But in the early 1770s, amid growing political strife between Great Britain and her American colonies, the former master and the former apprentice were reconciled. Lawrence reflected in a letter to a friend in South Carolina that Crockett had been, quote, misguided by other apprentices who had also been seeking partnership in Crockett's firm. And he reported his former mentor's contrition, quote, even 4 days ago, with great affection, pressing my hand in his, Crockett declared he was sensible he had used me very ill and that he should never forgive himself, end quote. This was a moment of personal reconciliation against a backdrop of geopolitical turmoil, and the two merchants exemplify the divergent paths that Charleston merchants might take. Having become a successful trader in Charleston, Lawrence invested heavily in plantations across South Carolina and into Georgia, becoming a major land and slave owner in the lower South. For his part, Crockett had begun his career in Charleston in the early 1730s, before transferring his business across the Atlantic to become London's principal merchant in the Carolina trade. Crockett was one of several such merchants who, unlike Lawrence, followed this path. These were men often born in Great Britain, who then spent much of their early careers in South Carolina, building up capital and connections in the colony before they returned to Britain. In the so-called mother country, they managed and grew rich from the British end of South Carolina's Atlantic trade. The names of these merchants, Crockett, Beswick, Shubrick, Nicholson, Greenwood, are largely forgotten today, not memorialized in street names or the names of towns or even counties like their Charleston counterparts may have been. But their influence was great in lobbying Parliament for preferential commercial regulation for South Carolinian products, and in setting the terms of South Carolina's external trade. And their wealth was also great. As the 18th century progressed, both of these elements, their influence and their wealth would take on increasingly sinister overtones for their trading counterparts in Charleston. So, to begin with James Crockett, a Scottish emigrant to South Carolina, during the 1730s, he emerged as one of Charleston's major merchants, trading first in deer skins, later in naval stores and rice, and retailing a vast range of consumer goods from his store on Broad Street. Here we have one of his newspaper adverts from 1733, which is typical. It reads, "Just imported in the Elizabeth, Captain Lee from London, and to be sold by James Crockett, a choice cargo of European and East India goods, containing the greatest variety of useful and ornamental goods that ever was for sale in this province, where a large discount will be made for ready money. He also has great choice of bob wigs, most sorts of medicines, Madeira wine, good butter in cask at 3 shillings the pound." During the decade of the 1730s, Charleston came to own a number of properties in Charleston, agricultural land on Charleston Neck to the north of the town, and undeveloped land elsewhere in South Carolina, probably anticipating the rapid expansion of plantation agriculture in the colony. He became one of the colony's principal merchants, and the scale of his business in Charleston was such that he acquired a wharf, or bridges as they were known locally, one of only 8 in the city in the 1730s. Crockett's Bridge was the northernmost of the 8 along the Cooper River, located at the east end of Queen Street. The wharves doubled as storage facilities for goods to be exported and outlets for selling imported goods. But the riches on offer in South Carolina paled in comparison to those to be made at the heart of the empire. And this, perhaps coupled with the high morbidity of early South Carolina, and he had a young family at this point, led Crockett back to London. Over the next 2 decades, he would emerge as the wealthiest and most prominent of London's specialist Carolina merchants. These merchants were a distinct group in the capital, defined by their specialism in importing South Carolina's principal exports, rice, indigo, and naval stores, and in sending out to the colony the manufactured goods and textiles which, by law, American colonials were barred from developing themselves. Interestingly, the London Carolina traders appear to have mostly avoided the slave trade, not through any moral scruples, I think, because they were certainly content to profit from the rice and indigo that was dependent on slave labor. More likely, their reticence was due to the greater financial risk involved in the slave trade, which was largely concentrated in the hands of specialist traders. So to give a sense of what drew merchants like James Crockett from Charleston to London and their degree of specialism as Carolina traders in the capital, here we have an image of London's Royal Exchange, shown in 1754. This was the principal site for the city's merchants to broker cargoes, agree insurance, and arrange commodity trades. It was a vital stop on a merchant's daily rounds. And we can see that this grand stone edifice is a far cry in scale from provincial Charleston. And here we have a plan of the inside of the exchange, where we can see a dedicated area for the capital's Carolina traders, or a walk, as it was known at the time. And you can see that here in the bottom left corner, alongside specific areas for for traders to Virginia, New England, and Jamaica, and to other parts of the world to mingle. Like other fields of commerce, the Carolina trade in London also had its own coffee house. Besides a place to drink coffee, it was a venue for merchants to meet, receive correspondence, read copies of colonial newspapers that had just arrived on merchant ships, and to do business. The Carolina Coffee House had existed in London since before 1749, when it could be found on Birchin Lane, a short walk from the Royal Exchange, and at the heart of the area where the Carolina merchants had their premises. This map of London from 1748 shows the area in green here, where the Carolina merchants had their trading houses, near to the river and in some of the City of London's prime real estate. For those of you familiar with London, I've shown in red the locations of St. Paul's Cathedral, the Tower of London, and further west, the Houses of Parliament along the river. Together, the Royal Exchange, the Carolina Coffee House, and the proximity of trading houses facilitated another of the Carolina traders' activities, petitioning. This was the principal way to intercede with politicians to seek preferential treatment for a trade, and London's Carolina traders used it to great effect in the middle decades of the 18th century. A petition on a particular issue could be circulated quickly amongst traders living and working near to one another and meeting one another daily at the coffee house, at the exchange's Carolina Walk, and at Riverside wharfs. Signatures to a petition could be collected quickly and the group mobilized, with the petition sent off to a sympathetic member of Parliament to introduce a bill, or back-channeled via civil servants at the Board of Trade, which oversaw commercial and colonial policy. The results in South Carolina's case were impressive. This lobbying secured favourable legislation in Parliament for Carolinian commodities, such as the Rice Act in 1730, which allowed South Carolina's rice to be exported to Spain and Portugal, opening new markets for the crop. In 1748, the traders secured passage of the Indigo Act, which put a bounty on South Carolinian indigo. This gave a helpful financial stimulus to what was then a new experimental crop in South Carolina, but which went on to become the colony's second most valuable export. Other lobbying secured bounties for Carolinian exports such as potash in 1751 and hemp in 1764, and attempted, albeit unsuccessfully, to promote the cultivation of silk as a further cash crop for South Carolina and Georgia. For such reasons were these London Carolina traders considered, in the words of one Charleston merchant, quote, friends at home, a doubly telling phrase, revealing as it does Charlestonians' conceptions both of their counterparts in London and their relationship to the mother country, home. For much of the 18th century then, there was a presumed mutuality of interest between Carolina merchants on either side of the Atlantic. Merchants in London supplied their counterparts in Charleston with much needed trading goods, and in some cases slaves, in exchange for the colony's staple exports, rice, indigo, deerskins, and naval stores. They used their political influence to secure favourable treatment for Carolinian crops, to diversify the colony's economy, and to boost its wealth. By the 1760s, however, the sense that mutual interest underpinned the metropolitan colonial relationship was fraying. In the rest of this talk, I'll focus on one element of this, the perceptions of profiteering and monopolization among the London traders, which helped to turn their Charleston counterparts against them. Writing to a correspondent in London in 1764, Henry Lawrence complained, "The Carolina agents or factors to a man have sustained as few losses by their trade to this colony as have been felt or known in any trade whatever to America. They have almost to a man, by means of their commissions and profits arising from such trade, risen from humble and moderate fortunes to great affluence, from walking upon foot to the command of conveniences which render their legs and feet almost useless. These facts are very notorious and on which I need not enlarge." The grand lifestyles of London's Carolina traders, as they profited handsomely on the back of South Carolina's economic growth, bear out Lawrence's caustic remarks on their great affluence. By the mid-1760s, there were 6 principal firms in London which dominated the capital's Carolina trade: James and Charles Crockett, John Beswick, Richard Shubrick, John Nutt, Grubb and Watson, and Sarah Nicholson, a rare female merchant in an almost entirely male world. The trappings of their wealth are illustrative. The merchants acquired grand mansions in England's home counties within 20 miles and easy reach of London. In so doing, they followed a path from counting house to landed estate that was only achieved by the most successful of London's overseas traders, most often the West Indies merchants trading with the sugar islands of the Caribbean. James Crockett bought Luxborough Hall in Essex, about 11 miles northeast of London, for the vast sum of £19,500 in 1750, and he spent a further £10,000 repairing and furnishing the house. Here we have a view of its front in a slightly later image, and we can immediately see that this was a major and prestigious mansion with its grand portico and elegant proportions. Another image of the side of the house shows an idealized rural scene of haymaking against this fine backdrop. One visitor from South Carolina paid Crockett a visit to his Luxborough Hall house and dryly remarked that, quote, "I think he has grandeur enough for his money," end quote. Besides his lordly Luxborough Hall estate, James Crockett was able to bestow £10,000 on his son Charles at his marriage. The union was portrayed by no less an artist than Thomas Gainsborough in the image we have here. Unusually, it shows the young man not with his bride-to-be, but with his brother-in-law, together with their music tutor. This is unconventional, perhaps, but the intended effect is the same, to depict a sense of cultivation and refinement, particularly important given the Crockett family background. The father, James, had risen from humble origins to success in trade in Charleston, to a fortune in trade in London, and now to landed gentility, and a commission for the finest portrait artist of his day. Having reinvested and augmented in London the proceeds from trading careers that they had begun in Charlestown, other traders such as John and Sarah Nicholson, John Beswick, and Richard Shubrick also embarked on the path to landed gentility. John Nicholson was reckoned at his death to be worth some £20,000, with assets including a country retreat 15 miles northwest of London at Great Stanmore, Middlesex. A few miles to the south, John Beswick invested his proceeds from the Carolina trade in a large country mansion in Hillingdon, conveniently located near the highway from London to the fashionable spa resorts of Bath and Cheltenham. Beswick styled it his, quote, country seat. It was appropriately named Little London. Here we have a slightly later map of the area with the estate circled. Besides his estate land and property, Beswick had at least £20,000 in liquid assets at his death, including the £500 he left, quote, to my Negro manservant, Anthony, perhaps a former household slave he had brought to London when he relocated from Charleston 20 years earlier. When Beswick died in 1764, Little London and its adjacent estate passed to his nephew and business partner, William Greenwood. The house and estate were later auctioned at Christie's, then as now one of London's top auction houses. The sale advertisement reveals the estate's desirability. Little London was, quote, an elegant villa with roomy stabling, coach house, offices of every description, attached and detached, excellent walled garden, lawn, shrubbery, containing about 31 acres, and sundry rich enclosures comprising about 64 acres, forming in the whole a desirable residence. End quote. Also for sale was the freehold of, quote, several substantial houses with their gardens, offices, and land, in the whole about 200 acres. And in addition to his Middlesex estates, Greenwood amassed large landholdings in Yorkshire in the north of England. Richard Shubrick, for his part, had begun his career as a ship's captain in Atlantic trade, before setting up store in Charleston and then relocating his business to London. He owned properties east of London at Mile End and Greenwich, areas known for their mansions, gentility, and popularity with affluent merchants and mariners. Here we have a map of Greenwich, just south of the Great Bend in the River Thames, east of London. On his death, Shubrick left his widow and children several £1,000s in government stock and cash, along with his coach, chariot, and horses, abundant evidence of his elite lifestyle. His son, also Richard, owned a, quote, very pleasant and desirable villa, end quote, with gardens, orchards, and 18 acres of land in Enfield, 10 miles north of London. The London merchants' wealth put even their richest counterparts in South Carolina in the shade. In a sample of 84 residents of Charleston district who died in 1774, the mean net worth of the 10 richest was £11,078 sterling, a figure comprising the value of their land, slaves, and goods. Take out the richest, Peter Manigault, who had a net worth at death of £32,000, and the mean average drops to just £8,600. These Charlestonians were amongst the richest men anywhere in North America. 9 of the 10 richest people to die in the North American colonies in 1774 were South Carolinians. Their wealth was modest, however, compared to the capital's leading Carolina traders, with their English country estates and City of London counting houses. In the context of London commerce, the Carolina merchants' addresses in the City of London highlight their elite status. At the heart of the City of London, a short walk from the Royal Exchange and Carolina Coffee House, the streets and squares where the Carolina merchants congregated during the 1760s, such as Billiter Square and New Broad Street, offered some of London's top business addresses, suggesting that the trade was increasingly lucrative. This map of Aldgate Ward gives an impression of the small squares and courtyards filled with merchants' counting houses and stores that made up the City of London at the time. At his premises in Cloak Lane, James Crockett was the second highest ratepayer in the precinct and employed at least 4 apprentices as clerks and bookkeepers. By 1763, Crockett had effectively retired from Carolina trade and was only in nominal partnership with his son Charles, but he still paid a very high £84 in personal tax and £14 in tax on his property. The same year, Richard Shubrick paid £16 and 8 shillings in tax on his barnyard premises. That year too, John Beswick paid rates of £20 on his Queen Street premises and £100 in personal tax. These tax returns placed both Beswick and Crockett amongst the wealthiest London merchants in overseas trade. Only 43 London merchants across all branches of trade paid £100 or more in personal tax in 1763. And depictions of the merchants' London houses shine further light on their wealth. Counting houses served as homes, at least during the working week, blurring the boundaries between merchants' professional and personal lives. Merchants commonly lived above their working quarters and shared living space with their families and with their clerks and apprentices. And while London merchants were generally restrained in their displays of wealth, at least in their premises in the city, the capital's leading Carolina merchants defied convention. William Greenwood's counting house in Budge Row rivaled any City of London dwelling and marked him out as a merchant of the highest rank. His was, quote, a commodious, substantial brick dwelling house and offices, courtyard, counting house, with cold bath and standing for 2 carriages and stabling for 5 horses, end quote. Its grand interior included, quote, 14 bedchambers and dressing rooms, a genteel dressing room, breakfast and dining parlours, noble hall, principal and back stairs, a convenient kitchen, laundry, and suitable connected offices and cellarage, end quote. The house of another London Carolina trader, Charles Ogilvie, in Fludyer Street, Westminster, epitomised metropolitan gentility. On a fashionable residential street that linked Whitehall with St. James's Park, it was richly decorated with, quote, pea green silk tabaret curtains sofa chairs and stools, elegant pier glasses and girandoles, a needlework carpet, fashionable sideboard of plate containing 800 ounces, fine household linen, china, a small library of modern books, wines, a large iron repository, and other valuable effects. While he also kept premises in Billiter Square in the heart of the City of London, Ogilvy's Fludyer Street house gave him easy access to the pleasures of London's West End and to Parliament, where he was briefly an MP in the early 1770s. As London's Carolina merchants lived more and more extravagantly on the back of their commerce, some in South Carolina began to harbour suspicions about the business practices which generated such profits. The alleged treatment of Carolinian commodities in London was a particular grievance and a challenge to the probity of London's merchants, accentuating suspicions of metropolitan bias against South Carolina's producers and exporters. The capital's indigo traders were widely imagined to be bilking Carolinian producers through a cabal to disparage the quality of the product. A report in the Gentleman's Magazine claimed that, quote, to the very great discouragement of the planters, the dealers in that commodity have combined to lessen and run down the value of it, Carolina indigo, till they get it at a very low rate into their hands, and then sell it for French indigo, which they set a much higher value upon, end quote. The implication here is that London merchants were passing off Carolinian indigo as dye from the French West Indies, which commanded a higher price, and were pocketing the difference. The charge was made publicly in Charleston. Moses Lindo, appointed by the colony as Inspector General of Indigo in an effort to raise the quality of exports of the dye, pronounced in the South Carolina Gazette that, quote, it is beyond dispute that a cabal has been formed in London, united with some who are obliged to this province for a great part of what they enjoy, to depreciate Carolina indigo. Historians have shown that the poorer reputation of Carolinian indigo and the lower price it fetched than French and Spanish indigo was, for the most part, deserved. It was the serviceability of South Carolina's crop as a low-cost dye stuff for Europe's textile sector, which underlay the strong growth of the colony's indigo production and exports in the third quarter of the 18th century. Nonetheless, the perception of malign practices was real. London dealers' tricks of the trade were more than simply economic slights. For South Carolina's indigo producers, used to the high esteem their rice garnered in overseas markets, the poor reputation of their indigo represented a powerful challenge to their skills as planters. Conspiracy theories served subconsciously to absolve indigo planters from the imputations about the low standing of their product. London traders made an easy target for their anger. Claims of metropolitan sharp practice explicitly contrasted commodity markets in London with those in Britain's regional ports. Henry Lawrence complained of a, quote, most extraordinary loss, end quote, of about 9% in weight in the indigo he had shipped to one London firm in April 1763, as a, quote, remarkably dry parcel, end quote, which he had packed himself Lawrence was convinced that the lost weight could only have been due to fraud in London. He lamented that, quote, such a loss was unknown upon indigo some 6 or 7 years ago, and, thank God, is still unknown in Bristol and Liverpool, end quote. Lawrence feared that indigo was falling prey to the swindles long suspected of London importers of other colonial products, such as naval stores. Again, a distinction was drawn between the markets for pitch and tar in London and in the regional ports of Britain. Lawrence told one London correspondent that, quote, a fact not to be denied is that if you divide a parcel of pitch weighing in average 360 pounds gross per barrel or thereabouts, when shipped one half to Bristol and the other half to London, the former will hold its weight and produce a full credit in your account sale, but the latter will fall short, at least 15%, end quote. He noted that, quote, purchase the very same barrel and transport it to Poole, a port on England's south coast, and it will there be as ponderous as it was in South Carolina, end quote. Claims of fraud at the hands of London dealers were not unique to the 1760s, either for Carolinian or other colonial commodities. As with naval stores, systematic fraud was also held to be commonplace within the capital's deerskins trade. Lawrence himself had been on the receiving end of the machinations of London deerskin traders at the start of his career in the 1740s, a cautionary experience he would remember for the rest of his life. By the 1760s, however, sharp practices in the naval stores and deerskins markets paled in comparison to suspected malfeasance in the indigo trade. Deerskins and naval stores accounted for a decreasing share of South Carolina's exports, and their economic importance to the colony had shrunk proportionately. Indigo, on the other hand, represented a growing and increasingly vital commodity for South Carolina, and was well established as the colony's second most valuable export. Metropolitan conspiracy against Carolinian indigo therefore represented a far greater affront to South Carolinians. By assailing the character of Carolinian indigo, it simultaneously challenged planters' self-conceived expertise and judgment. Neither planters nor merchants in South Carolina felt an equivalent personal pride in the naval stores or deerskins they sent to Britain. And economically, the greater value of the indigo to the colony, greater value of indigo to the colony by the 1760s meant that price depreciations were recognized to be of much greater consequence. London's dominance of the indigo market further aggravated the supposedly sharp practices in the trade. Unlike the rice trade, in which South Carolina's planters generally sold their grain to commission merchants in Charleston, larger indigo growers sent their produce on their own account and risk to London. This reflected the long-standing expertise in indigo dealing in the capital and its preeminence as a centre for distributing dyestuffs in Britain and to continental Europe. The first pamphlets to encourage indigo culture in South Carolina had asserted the primacy of the London market, trumpeting the capital's standing as the, quote, greatest and best market for indigo in the world, end quote, and advising that the buyers are mostly rich men. In sending their indigo to London, planters hoped to achieve the good prices they felt their produce deserved. And the city became by far the largest destination for Carolinian indigo, receiving around 9/10 of the colony's indigo exports during the 1760s. In contrast, opportunities for South Carolina's producers to divert their indigo exports to Britain's regional ports were limited, and by law, indigo exports to foreign markets were forbidden. The comparative advantages London possessed in the marketing of indigo left producers with little choice but to live with the supposed sharp practices of its dealers and traders. And echoing London's overall control of the indigo trade in the British Empire, the trade in the dye within the capital was itself controlled by a handful of merchants. This further curtailed the ability of colonial sellers to circumvent unfair practices in London by sending their indigo to other buyers. So what we have then, by the 1760s, is a growing divergence between Charleston's merchants and their counterparts in London. There was a mounting sense in South Carolina that the traders who handled the colony's exports in the mother country had formed a clique, even a cabal. They were accused of using their influence to profiteer at the expense of their Charleston trading partners. The supposed sharp practices and vast wealth they accumulated served as evidence for this. Their interests were no longer in perfect alignment with the interests of their counterparts in South Carolina. And at the same time, the political lobbying which London merchants had done so effectively on behalf of South Carolina took a different turn. While they had been willing to make the case for commercial bounties on indigo, naval stores, or potash, as the political disputes between Britain and the American colonies grew in the late 1760s and early 1770s, the merchants proved unwilling to intercede with the British government. They were notably quiet in the face of the Townsend duties imposed on American imports of tea, glass, lead, and paints in 1767. Only 3 years later did they petition Parliament to revoke the duties following coordinated protests in the colonies which threatened their livelihoods. Again, in 1773 and 1774, the London Carolina merchants failed to take up the cause of the colonies. They put forward only a muted response to the so-called intolerable acts which the British government had imposed in retaliation for the Boston Tea Party. By this stage, even a pillar of Anglo-American trade, such as Henry Lawrence, himself a relative political moderate, would write of London's Carolina merchants that, quote, "I don't know that we have a zealous friend or advocate amongst them, one or two excepted," end quote. Josiah Quincy Jr., a young Bostonian whose travels took him to both Charleston and London in the early 1770s, would comment on a visit to London in early 1775 that there were just 11 merchants in the whole of London that he did not consider bitter enemies of America. Now, I don't want to suggest for a minute that all this offers a universal explanation for Charleston merchants' discontent in the 1760s or 1770s, let alone the wider growth of anti-imperial feeling in South Carolina elsewhere. Beware the historian with a monocausal explanation. But I think it is an important element of the picture, and one which I think has been much overlooked. I hope, therefore, that I've shed some light today onto this dimension of the road to the American Revolution. When I began my research for my book, I wanted to address the conundrum of why so many of Charleston's merchants should reject the system which had made them so rich. Amongst all the residents of British North America, these were the men who had perhaps gained most from the mercantilist and protectionist system that the British Empire offered them, and who were amongst the wealthiest of all Americans on the eve of the Revolution. Writing this book, as I hope today's talk has shown, has helped to explain this, and on a personal note, taken me on some wonderful archival adventures. Thank you very much.
Well, bravo, Huw. That was wonderful. And certainly I am enlightened. I did not know about these individuals whatsoever. I know it is getting late in Oxford. Do you have a few minutes for a couple of questions?
I certainly do.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if I can find some. Someone asked, what was the role of banks in the London-Charleston trade? It seemed like a lot of credit was extended one to another by the merchants, but did banks get involved at all?
So we're just seeing the emergence of banks in this period, and because the evolution of overseas trade was one of the factors that led to the development of banks, because you're having loans and mechanisms for the exchange of credit that are being extended across oceans and across periods of 6, 9 months, a year or 2 years. For the most part, the merchants in the Carolina trade were offering credit themselves. So they were sort of serving as the prototypical merchant banks. And of course, this is how merchant banking really developed its name. It comes about as an offshoot of trade itself. Banks, certainly regional and local banks, are developing in Britain. We'll see them develop in the early United States towards the end of the 18th century. But for the most part, this trade is facilitated in terms of credit by the credit that the merchants themselves are offering in this period of the middle decades of the 18th century, at least.
Interesting. Okay. Another person wanted to know if Crockett had wealth when he first went to Charleston.
I wish I knew. And one of the most exciting things about working with these relatively obscure merchants is shedding, it feels like in many cases, shedding light on them for the very first time, piecing together their lives from mortgages, from land plats, at a later stage of their lives, from their wills, of lawsuits that they were involved in. What is often very difficult is to find evidence of their early lives. So I know that Crockett was born just outside Edinburgh in 1701, but he next emerges in Charleston really thanks to the publication of the South Carolina Gazette from, I think, 1732 or 1733 onwards, and we can begin to trace his advertisements there. So we know by that stage he was already set up as an independent trader. He may have come over to South Carolina with an introduction or indeed accompanying another merchant. He may have come across more speculatively or even as a ship's captain. That was another route which a lot of merchants took to get into trade. They'd come over as a ship's captain, trading somebody else's goods for the most part, but sometimes carrying their own small cargo of goods, then selling that and using the proceeds to set up a store and establish themselves in trade. But unfortunately, I'd love to find out a little bit more about Crockett's early life. Other than a birth certificate, the first 30 or so years have eluded me so far.
Hard when you get that long ago. And another, and I'm afraid we just have time for one more. So the last question is, do you know if the relationship between Charleston and London differed than the relationship between London and other North American cities?
It's a very good question. There are certainly parallels. I know of some very good work on Philadelphia in particular in the period, and you see similar sorts of patterns. What does stand out, though, is the particular concentration of trade, as I alluded to in the paper, of the London end of the trade in a very small number of trading houses. So comparatively, you have many more, a dozen or more copies of the merchants, rather, in the London end of the Virginia trade, similar or if not more trading to the middle colonies, to Pennsylvania, to New York, and also higher numbers as well to New England. So this is one of the theories that I posit in the book, which is that the concentration of trade in a relatively small number of hands allowed them to dominate and to profit in the really extraordinary way that they did.
Interesting. I did see a question asking about where they could get your book, and I assume that's available through USC Press.
It is, and I believe there was a 40 or 50% discount in the month of February. So so do take a look at the University of South Carolina Press, and thank you for your interest in it.
Well, this has been a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Huw David, for joining us today. And we also appreciate everyone who attended. I hope this one being our last of our winter lectures, you will check out our website and look for our other events that we'll be holding this year. Take care and see everyone soon. Thank you again, Huw.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.